Hello everyone. I have one video left that I need to do to finish my Friday. So I'm recording this on Thursday afternoon, so it will post live tomorrow. We need to discuss the first part of chapter 24, which means I need to go back a couple slides here. I'm hoping I can get all the way through all this material, but we're actually supposed to do the first part of chapter 24 in 2 days, so hopefully I can get through this. We're looking at the period from 1963 to 1973, so the 60s generation. And I think some of us can understand why that would be called the shattered society. It was a time of great unrest and a lot of political activism, civil unrest, just a lot of not a really pleasant place to live here in the United States at that point. I'm going to skip through these questions. Here we go. We need this one. Oh. We had a couple, as you noticed in today's assignment, Thursday's assignment, the assassination of President Kennedy. We had a lot of violent murders of notable citizens that were just individual highlights in this decade of unrest. John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., the attempted assassination of presidential candidate George Wallace in Alabama. Don't get me started on him because I grew up in Alabama and I've seen what he did. But just horrible things and not a good place to be at that point. Okay, so let's talk about President Johnson first. For those of you who are taking notes, remember the notes themselves, the PowerPoint, is on Google Classroom, so you can get it off of there. You don't have to take notes while I talk. Lyndon Johnson was probably one of the best prepared for political leadership presidents that we have had, and that was mostly because he'd been in Congress since 1931. He had started as a congressional aide and then had been elected to the House of Representatives in 1937, when then turned around and was elected to the Senate in 1948, served there for a number of years. He even served as the Senate Majority Leader. So he was the Charles Schumer of the 1940s and 50s. So he was well versed in how to get things done in Congress as the majority leader for part of the time, minority leader. He knew how to get things done. His campaign slogan and his philosophy of government was he was looking to build a great society. What did he mean by that term? Well, he wanted a society in which government would help all the citizens gain the opportunity to better themselves. All of us become better. All of us. That was his idea. Okay, so one of the biggest things that Lyndon Johnson needs to be remembered for is his part in the civil rights movement. He passed laws, he got things through Congress as far as civil rights goes that no president before him had bothered to try. He was very insistent on it, to his credit. He wanted equal rights for all. So one of the first things he did, remember, he took office in late November of 1963 at the assassination of Kennedy. He will have to run for his own term in 1964. We'll get to that in a minute. But he helped Congress pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In that Civil Rights Act of 1964, they did things like made fairer procedures for voter registration. There could be no racial discrimination in public buildings. It called for the desegregation of public schools. It created the Equal Opportunity Commission, which was going to help regulate employment, making sure that nobody was discriminated against when it came to hiring. So a lot of things were in that Civil Rights Act of 1964 that were really good things and needed to be done. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 came the following year. This one particularly aimed at voter registrations and things of that nature. Outlawed literacy tests. You did not have to pass a test to make sure you could read in order to vote. Okay, that was what a literacy test was. And it really just kind of augmented or helped the newly passed 24th Amendment. Now, what is the 24th Amendment? The 24th Amendment prohibited poll tax. You could not be forced to pay a fine or pay a tax in order to vote. So no poll tax, no literacy test. You had to be given the right to vote based on your citizenship and no other reason. However, these days we're talking about giving voter registration to non-citizens. That I have a problem with. Okay, let's move on. I miss our discussions in class about those kind of things. Another thing Johnson did was the war on poverty. He, in his first State of the Union address, declared that we were going to fight a war on poverty, and he included in that funding for programs like Head Start, one of the programs we still have around here that helps mostly African-American families, but I think it helps all families below the poverty line be able to afford childcare and a good educational start for their children. It also included Volunteers in Service to America, which was kind of like an American domestic version of the Peace Corps, sending young kids, young teenagers, young adults out to serve America in places where they needed that. Maybe, you know, in rural areas or things of that nature. Okay, so the 1964 election comes around really fast. Lyndon Johnson doesn't have but 1 year really to prepare for that. I would love for the day that we only have a 1 year term of where we only have 1 year where they have to run for office. But it's going to pit Lyndon Johnson as the Democratic candidate against Republican Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a good man. He was an honest, unbending conservative. He was not going to whitewash what he said just to please a crowd. He didn't mind telling it like it was. He's very, very honest. Probably quite a bit like our current president, only he didn't toot his own horn so much, I think, as our current president does. But Goldwater just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Because he didn't mind telling, you know, a crowd of people in Tennessee that he thought the Tennessee Valley Authority needed to go away, or a crowd of senior citizens that Medicare was stupid. He was just too honest to be a good politician. Okay. So Lyndon Johnson wins this presidential election by a wide margin. Your book calls it a wide margin. It was 61%, which doesn't seem that wide to me, 61% to 39%, but in a way it is. The Democrats also gained control of both houses of Congress by wide margins. So any measure that they wanted to put through through Congress was going to make it. So in the coming days after he receives this vote of confidence from the people, he starts putting through lots of legislation. Now remember, the president does not put through legislation. Congress does. But he sure can suggest things and he can encourage things. So there's a flood of legislation that goes through at Johnson's behest, his request. I think it was 38 or 39 bills. No, I'm sorry, I'm way off on that. 89 bills that he gets through Congress according to his agenda, what he wants to do. Some of those bills include federal aid to education. He adds Medicare as a thing that we have to do now, and we are required. When you start working, you're going to see Medicare as a line item of something that comes out of your check. Every week, we pay for Medicare. This is a government health insurance program that provides care for elderly people. Probably your grandparents are on Medicare. That is their primary insurance. But another thing that is coming along in here that we need to talk about is the Warren Court. It's called the Warren Court, and it actually, I believe this was mentioned maybe in your video yesterday. If not, it was a different one that I watched. The Chief Justice at this point was Earl Warren. He had been appointed by Eisenhower, the previous president, to Kennedy. And Eisenhower said afterwards that it was one of the biggest mistakes he made as president, was the appointing of Chief Justice Earl Warren. Earl Warren was a judicial activist, meaning that he used his position in the court to accomplish his own agenda. That is not the job of a Supreme Court person. Okay. But he did use his job that way. Now, not everything he did was bad, but it was just, that's not his job. As a member of the Supreme Court, his job is to see if a law matches up to the Constitution. That is it. But he used it in wide ways he applied the law liberally to make sure he got his agenda done. Okay. One of those things was the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which ended segregation of public schools. We talked about that at the tail end of the last chapter. And again, I'm not saying that that was a bad thing. That was a good thing. It needed done. But some of these other things that we will talk about, maybe not so much. Some of the other good things he did was Gideon versus Wainwright in the Warren Court. This is the court case that ultimately made that statement. If you do not have the money to hire an attorney, the court will appoint one for you. Nobody's going to go without an attorney to defend them. Okay. The next one was Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. In this one guaranteed us those Miranda rights. You cannot be arrested without being without being Mirandized, given your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you do say can be used against you in a court of law, and on it goes. Okay, that was decided here in the 1960s. Oops, went the wrong way. Sorry. I'm almost done. Oh, there it is. One more set. Engel versus Vitale. In this court case, public state-sponsored prayer in public school was done away with. No more praying in public school. And you see how I say that some of these things were good, but this one obviously was not something that I would think would be a good idea, to take prayer out of school. And then in Roth versus the United States, this is another one that I feel was really an overstep of the court. Obscenity was determined not to be protected by the First Amendment, which sounds like a good thing. Let's get rid of obscenity. But then what they did was they defined obscenity very narrowly. It had to meet these certain criteria in order to be obscene. Otherwise, it was allowed. Well, the way they defined it so narrowly meant that the pornography industry bloomed, and it became really enormous and could not be controlled in the 1960s. The court also did things that we're going to call this the one man, one vote decisions, where they redrew districting lines to make things what they thought was more fair. Now, the one man who dissented a lot of this time was Justice John Harlan, and your book talks about him and reads, and there's a comment in there about what he said. This court does not serve its high purpose when it exceeds its authority, even to satisfy justified impatience with the slow working of the political process. And I agree with him. It's not the court's job to rush the political process. It's the court's job to keep things according to the Constitution. So that is all that section. The next time we meet, we will talk about Johnson in Vietnam. So we will see what he is going to do with the Vietnam War and go from there. Okay? Have a good day and happy Friday.